put in place in 1986. Former Defense Secretary Dick Cheney, Deputy Secretary John White, and National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft are the panelists. Former Defense Undersecretary Paul Wolfowitz serves as the moderator. They came together at Syracuse University in October for about 2 hours.
Well, thank you all for your patience. Good morning and welcome to the Syracuse University campus. My name is Sean O'Keefe, and I am the Lewis A. Bantle Professor of Business and Government Policy. This is an endowed chair established at the university's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs to explore issues pertaining to management and organization, the public policy relationships with the business community, and the examination of best practices of the public and private sectors. The symposium we convene today focuses on the first objective, management and organization. In 1986, the Congress enacted the most far-reaching reorganization of the Department of Defense in half a century. The so-called Goldwater-Nichols Act has had a profound effect on the development of national security policy, the conduct of military operations, and the management of personnel, logistics, and acquisition. This is the third day of our exploration of the far-reaching impact of Goldwater-Nichols. Through a consideration of its origins, its implementation over the past decade, and prospect of future amendments to strengthen the management and organization of the Defense Department. I'm proud to join Dr. John White, a distinguished alumnus of the Maxwell School here at Syracuse, and a panelist in this morning's proceedings, the former Deputy Secretary of Defense, as a co-sponsor of this symposium. In addition to our distinguished speakers, joining us today are students, faculty, and alumni from across the Syracuse University community. In addition, we are joined by the participants in the National Security Management course, a 2-month course of instruction for senior executives in the national security establishment. This program is offered by the National Security Studies, a partnership of the Maxwell School here at Syracuse and the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. The Dean of Johns Hopkins SAIS, Dr. Paul Wolfowitz, is here today to moderate the panel which will follow. The morning's proceeding will begin with a discussion by 2 distinguished speakers, General Brent Scowcroft and former Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney, followed by a roundtable discussion. Our first speaker this morning is General Brent Scowcroft. He has the distinction of having served as the President's National Security Advisor both before and after the enactment of this historic piece of legislation. He served as the National Security Advisor to President Ford in the 1970s. As a matter of fact, served with Secretary Cheney at the time he was Chief of Staff to President Ford, and later as the National Security Advisor to President George Bush. He is the co-author of the book A World Transformed with President Bush, and is here this morning to join us to talk a little bit about the differences in the span of his time that he served in those 2 very important positions at a seminal time in our national security history. General Brent Scowcroft.
Thank you very much, Sean, for that very kind introduction. It's nice to be with you all here this morning in beautiful Syracuse University. I want to tell you that I am not a student of Goldwater-Nichols. Indeed, first thought as I looked at the participants here, what am I doing with all these experts on this subject? And then I thought, well, I've been doing that all my life, so why should this be any different? It reminds me of the story about the doctor who was called by the chairman of the local women's forum, women's club, to ask if he would give a speech to them on the subject of sex. And he said, sure, he'd be happy to. The evening came around and he was getting dressed. His wife said, where are you going? He said, I'm going to address the women's club. And she said, oh, what are you going to talk about? Well, for some reason, he felt a little uneasy telling her what the subject was, so he says, I'm going to talk about sailing. So about a week later, the doctor's wife was walking down the street and ran into the president of the women's club, and she said, oh, your husband just gave us the most marvelous lecture the other evening. We were enthralled. And the wife said, well, I can't imagine why. He's only done it twice. The first time he threw up, and the second time he lost his hat. There's one benefit this morning, though. For the first time that I can remember, I'm not having to clean up after Dick Cheney. You know, he usually stands up and picks all the choice meat off the bones, walks off the stage, and leaves me with a carcass to try to do something with. I was involved a little bit with Jim Locker and many others in the very long gestation of Goldwater-Nichols, participating in studying groups, reviewing drafts of legislation, maybe even testifying at one point, meeting with Senator Goldwater. So it has been a subject dear to my heart for a long time, but as I say, I'm not an expert. So my remarks are not going to be comprehensive, but will reflect my own experiences. And if I duplicate what other of my friends have already said up here or will say, I apologize. I had in my military career, or government career I should say, 4 jobs relevant to the subject of our discussion. Sean has mentioned 2 of them. National Security Advisor, both before Goldwater-Nichols and after. But I also sort of marched up or down the food chain, whichever direction you want, starting as a colonel, as a service planner, working with the Joint Staff to produce Joint Staff documents. Each service had a small, stable 3 or 4 service planners whose job it was to negotiate with the Joint Staff to produce the papers which went up through, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. I went from that down to the Joint Staff to be the special assistant to the director of the Joint Staff. And that job was a sort of traffic cop, mother confessor, what have you. My job was to prepare the director for meetings with the operational deputies of the services who would be the ones to work with papers before the Joint Chiefs of Staff met, and also to explain the papers to the chairman's, what then was a chairman's staff group who prepared him for these kinds of meetings, and even more importantly, to work out with counterparts in each of the services positions on papers. In other words, I would try to find out where they were, what they needed, and how they thought it would come out. And sometimes they would tell me, and sometimes they would sandbag me. But anyway, that was the sort of process. So I was right in the middle of the technical process of doing the work for the Joint Chiefs of Staff in their formal paperwork. Starting at the bottom, the basic task of a service planner, and this was around 1970, if you will, was to protect your own turf, that is the turf of your service. Let nothing bad happen to your service. And secondly, if you could, carve out a little bigger share for your service of whatever was happening. The process tended to be looked at least while I was in it, as a zero-sum game. You were out with a bunch of people trying to steal your shirt. and your job was to protect your shirt, and if you could take his, that was fine. The other services were your principal adversaries, and the joint staff representatives were, you sort of disdained them. They didn't run the process. They wrote the paper initially, but they didn't run the process. And what a process it was. It would usually start with the joint staff representatives preparing a paper on whatever the subject was. After they prepared the paper, they would send it out for very informal comments by the functional representatives of the services. And then the paper would become a flimsy. Now, where that name came from, I don't know. But it would go through then a formal stage from flimsy, where the action officers would work it. Then the paper would turn buff. I know where that came from. The paper was buff. It was printed on buff paper. The next higher level for discussion, then when it was approved there, the paper would turn green, and literally it would be printed on green stationery. And then when the chiefs had approved it, it would be red striped, which is literally a red stripe down through the green paper. Now, at every step in this process, the services had at the paper. And since the joint staff worked not for the chairman, but for the joint chiefs of staff, there was literally no control over what happened to the paper, because the joint chiefs of staff in their service hats didn't want to insist on the integrity of the paper. They wanted to protect their own service planners who were trying to improve it for the services. There were two general tendencies. The first was to hold out to the end. A paper had to be red striped, it had to be a consensus paper. In a very rare few pieces there was a dissent, but normally it had to be a consensus. So holding out to the end, whatever it was, usually got you a fair amount of what it was you wanted. Get the paper watered down, get offending paragraphs out, or to block what the joint staff wanted to do. The other alternative was a sort of a back-scratching operation. You go to the other services and you say, if you'll support me here, I'll give you this in this next paper. A log-rolling, back-scratching operation. And the result was that the papers tended either to be watered down, to be meaningless, or had a little bit for everybody in it. One of the results, incidentally, of this process was to bring about the whiz kid phenomenon, which started under McNamara, of a small staff in OSD who would do the work which the JCS seemed unable to do. Now, the service chiefs themselves had, at least in the Air Force, had an elaborate ritual for dealing with these papers. On the day of the JCS meeting, or usually the day before the meeting, the chief of staff would sit down in his little briefing room and would be briefed on the subjects by the service planner who was responsible for each paper. And he would be given elaborate talking notes to help him through the discussion the next day. Then after the meeting, he would come back up and debrief the same people with the results of the meeting. And of course, those people were sitting there grading him on how well he had defended their paper and how much bacon he had come home with. So his actions were partly theater, partly to demonstrate or to measure his leadership as a morale builder for his staff who had worked long and hard on the papers to produce the results. And in the back of his mind, if he didn't go to the mat for his own service, there was nobody else going to do it. So the whole atmosphere was one of, if you will, defensive combat. I'm not saying that the national interest, the military interest, was totally ignored, but all of the pressures were in the other direction. And the services tended to keep their best people in this process. They did put their best people on it, but they put them as the service planners, not down in the joint staff, because it was the service planners who manipulated, if they were good, the paper to both protect the service and advance its interest. So the second class people would tend to go down to the joint staff. So the best people were attacking the paper, and somewhat weaker people were defending it. Services at that time didn't generally reward joint staff duty. It was looked at as out of the line when all of your contemporaries were having good jobs in the service and getting good efficiency reports for jobs that the Air Force considered key. There was a rule about joint duty as being a prerequisite for achieving flag rank, but it was very loosely interpreted. That is what constituted joint duty. Services controlled promotions, personnel assignments. All of those are powerful weapons, even for somebody who says this is a crazy process. We ought to produce something that the Joint Chiefs of Staff can be proud of. My own job down in the Joint Chiefs of Staff was something of an anomaly in that regard, because my job was viewed by the Air Force as a prime intelligence operation. In other words, down where I was, I could find out what the other services were doing and thereby theoretically getting the jump of them. Of course, I would never do that. The whole system was so ponderous and dependent on the least willing member in any given case that it's surprising that it worked at all. And interestingly enough, there was frequently more time spent on trivial issues that never should have gone to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, because by holding out, you could get your way in a consensus world. So half of the meetings or more dealt with papers that never should have come before the Joint Chiefs of Staff themselves. When I got to the White House, the effects of this system, and I came right out of this system over to the White House, were readily apparent. It was my feeling, after sitting in NSC meetings and other informal meetings of the National Security Team, that military advice in the National Security Council and the Oval Office was seriously underrepresented. If the chairman had a position on an issue which was blessed by the chief, he could speak to that. But it was often a position that was too rigid, too narrow, off the mark, or irrelevant to the situation as it was developing or changing. Or if it was an issue on which the chiefs had not met and achieved a position, the chairman would be without instructions and therefore could not really take a position or play a substantive role in the discussion. Frequently, of course, especially in more formal meetings, the subject would shift during the meeting to issues which had not even been on the original agenda. Whatever the president wanted to talk about would be discussed. And then the chairman was doubly handicapped and really not able to be a real participant in the process. It did depend in part on the personality of the chairman, but his colleagues in the Joint Chiefs were always very alert to him saying things, committing things, doing things which they had not blessed. There was another debilitating aspect to the system. When the chairman was out of town, the acting chairman would be either the senior chief of staff in Washington, or it would be on a rotating basis. I don't remember exactly which it would, but the system went through both of those. The problem with that was that none of the chiefs, aside from the chairman, followed the operational issues closely enough to be able to fill in for the chairman. One of the principal examples I remember was the Mayaguez incident, where there was a U.S. ship seized off the coast of Cambodia, and we, with the Pueblo in mind, wanted to move very fast and to rescue the ship and especially the crew before they could be squirreled away on Cambodia somewhere out of our reach. So we wanted to move fast. We didn't have any forces out there. There was a carrier task force steaming down to Australia. There were some Marines in Okinawa having exercises and so on. There were some Air Force transports in Thailand. So what we were trying to do is cobble together a force that we could assemble really on the site, on the move, to deal with the situation. Well, the chairman happened to be out of town after on about the second meeting, and we had NSC meetings a couple of times a day. His fill-in, the acting chairman, simply didn't know what the situation was, didn't know where the forces were, couldn't describe the capabilities of the forces. Not his fault, but he was literally pulled out. The chairman's out of town, go to the meeting. And it was a major embarrassment. Now, when I came back in the same job under President Bush in 1989, I have to say at first I discerned not much difference. Goldwater-Nichols was in effect, but implementation, which began under Admiral Crowe, was slow because he moved very, very cautiously. And as far as his participation appeared to me, there was very little difference. But even at that early time, some structural changes were beginning to work. The first one was that the Joint Staff now worked for the chairman. And that meant that the integrity of the paper first drafted by the Joint Staff could be maintained through the process. And the service chiefs had only the ability to argue and persuade, not to stonewall and prevent. Following that, right away, the services learned, and they started to send instead of keeping their best people as the service planners, they started to send them to the Joint Staff because that's where the paper was now written and was by and large maintained. So you had to get in on the first draft. You couldn't work from the outside and pull the paper apart afterwards. And it became more attractive for good people too. It was a more exciting job because you were actually doing something and you could see your product become a product of the National Security Council, not simply see it disemboweled in the tank. And then one of the things that really did show up early on was the fact that there was now a vice chairman. A vice chairman with the same agenda as the chairman, with the same background, followed the issues the same way. So that when the chairman was out of town, You didn't miss a beat on being able to deal with problems. You had somebody always conversant with the issues. Then, of course, when General Powell came in, he took full advantage of his increased authority. And there, I think, I would describe the difference in the Oval Office and in NSC meetings as dramatic. He was a full participant in the discussions. And I think that military views became much more integrated into national decisions under Goldwater-Nichols, if you will, than they ever had been before. Because as I pointed out, the military really wasn't in a position to meaningfully debate in NSC, or even more importantly, in informal meetings. Military views were now an integral part of any discussion, which is critically important. The president himself would frequently ask if the chiefs agreed with Powell. You know, do you have unanimity? What do you have? And, you know, Colin would describe what the chiefs felt, some good, some were unhappy, some were, but I don't remember a single case where a chief took advantage of the Goldwater-Nichols provisions to formally dissent from a view of the chairman. So in sum, based on anecdotal evidence primarily, I believe that Goldwater-Nichols has been an unqualified success, without a doubt. But I don't think we can rest on our laurels. I still think there is enormous structural confusion in DOD with still services, unified commands, defense agencies, all looking at the same kind of problems. A look a couple of years ago at Cobart Towers indicated to me, for example, that the commander there was still subject to overlapping chains of command to a very confusing way. But that's to say, I think we should move forward, not back up. And looking at, as I did over the weekend, at many of the comments of the naysayers to Goldwater-Nichols, I think most of the comments that I've read are off the mark. As a military man in a non-military position in the White House, I believe that Goldwater-Nichols has established a much clearer, much sounder, and more balanced and respected military view than has ever been the case before. Thank you very much.
Thank you, General Scowcroft. Our next speaker this morning is a gentleman who has had an opportunity to serve in a variety of capacities before, during, and after the enactment of this particular historic legislation. He was a colleague of Senator Barry Goldwater and Congressman Bill Nichols, the two principal authors of this act, during the time he served as the member of Congress at large for the state of Wyoming. Previously, he had served, as I mentioned, as the Chief of Staff to President Ford. Thereafter, the Ford administration was elected to Congress for 6 terms, completed his service in the House of Representatives as the Republican whip, and was appointed Secretary of Defense in 1989 after the act was enacted. It was in that capacity that I was privileged to serve for him as the Controller and Chief Financial Officer of the Defense Department, and later as Secretary of the Navy. And his guidance to me in that capacity was one that was as clear as I could ever have imagined. On the day he appointed me to that position, he told me that he had heard, and passing on the same view, that throughout the Department of Defense, with almost 2 million people in uniform and civilian folks all over the world, there's somebody doing something profoundly stupid at any given moment. And your job now is to go explain that and have to deal with it. So as a consequence, his guidance was always quite crisp to me, and one in which I've never experienced any ambiguity. He is a friend, a mentor, and a gent I was privileged to serve for, the Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney.
Thank you very much, Sean. It's a bit like a reunion this morning to spend some time with General Scowcroft, Paul Wolfowitz, Sean O'Keefe, some great military leaders that are here today too as well. Admiral Joe Lopez, who was one of my military assistants, General Mike Carnes, who was on the director of the Joint Staff, Joe Hoare, who ran CENTCOM for us, Jim McCarthy, a distinguished Air Force General. So it's a pleasure to be back and have a chance to share a little bit of time with all of you. I feel obligated too at the outset of my remarks to remind everybody how I became Secretary of Defense. You may remember that President Bush's first choice was Senator Tower of Texas, and it was only after the Tower nomination was rejected that I was offered the nomination. In effect, I was the President's second choice to be Secretary of Defense. My wife still brings that up from time to time, usually in the midst of family disputes. And General Scowcroft has never let me forget it. So. But I did relish my time, obviously, as Secretary. It was certainly the highlight of my career. And I'm delighted to be here this morning to reflect a bit on Goldwater-Nichols and how it affected our operations during the Bush administration, as well as talk a little bit about my earlier perceptions of it. I think in the interest of sort of tracing my relationship and views on Goldwater-Nichols, I supported it and voted for it as a member of Congress, as part of the House Republican leadership and a member of the House Intelligence Committee. I did not serve on armed services, but I had an interest in a lot of those issues that were involved in the debate over Goldwater-Nichols. And as I say, I supported it. That was somewhat unusual for me, frankly, because my usual position on a measure that the Reagan administration felt strongly about was to be aligned with the President, my friends Cap Weinberger and Frank Carlucci, those men who preceded me in the Pentagon. This particular one, though, I disagreed with them, and I did, in fact, support the reform, in part because I thought there was ample evidence in the argument that the advocates of the reform were making, especially when you looked at military operations and the problems that have been encountered in Desert One, Mayaguez that Brent mentioned earlier this morning, the problems we had in Lebanon in '82, but especially Grenada. And Grenada because immediately after the invasion in Grenada, I was asked to join a small group of congressmen to go down to look at what had transpired in Grenada, to review the operation itself. And at the time, of course, there was this great sense of enthusiasm and satisfaction that we'd been able to go to Grenada, rescue all the Americans, minimal loss of life, etc. Over time, though, as we looked at the Grenada operation and more information came out, it was clear we still had major fundamental problems in terms of our ability to conduct a joint exercise, in terms of the politics that were played, small p politics between the various services to make sure everybody had a role when we undertook those kinds of operations, the inability of troops on the shore, Army troops to communicate with the Navy at sea to get fire support missions accomplished and so forth. The other thing that led me in the direction of supporting Goldwater-Nichols was I had great regard for Senator Goldwater and for Bill Nichols. I thought they were men whose backgrounds and experience and service in the Congress warranted careful consideration, and as I say, so in the final analysis I did vote for and support it. If I were to characterize my views on Goldwater-Nichols today after having operated under it for 4 years, from '89 to '93 in the Pentagon, my overall view is very positive, very similar to the views Brent's expressed this morning. That it was very definitely a plus, that we were clearly better off as a result of having Goldwater-Nichols on the books than would have been the case if it hadn't been there. So you can clearly put me down as pro Goldwater-Nichols, and frankly proud of the vote I cast for it, and I can't say that of all my votes that I cast while I was a member of Congress. To put it in context, I want to take just a couple of minutes this morning and talk a little bit about how I perceived my job as Secretary, what my priorities were, and how Goldwater-Nichols affected or influenced that, and then talk a little bit about some of the key elements that I think need to be considered in addition to Goldwater-Nichols in terms of assessing how the place functions and sometimes doesn't function. The first day I arrived in the Pentagon as the new secretary, I asked to see the organization chart of the Pentagon, Department of Defense. That was produced for me. It fell off the edges, lopped over the sides of that huge desk General Pershing used to operate behind, that's in the secretary's office in the department. And I looked at it, I was appalled, and I rolled it up and put it away and never looked at it again. And I concluded that I could either spend my time worrying about that organization chart, maybe try to fix it, or I could be Secretary of Defense, but I couldn't do both. And I opted to ignore the organization chart in a sense, and not worry that much about how the boxes and lines were all drawn on there, because it is a huge, complex organization, and to focus instead upon priorities and those things I wanted to focus on. My number one priority as Secretary, obviously, was the President. He was the boss, he was the man who'd hired me, he was the Commander-in-Chief, and right at the top of the list of things I wanted to worry about was whatever he wanted me to worry about. Second, and of important significance as well, were my relationships with my colleagues in the National Security Council, specifically the President's National Security Advisor and the Secretary of State, and how we functioned as a group. My experience by then, having been in Washington some 20 years, was that the relationships between the principals and the NSC had usually been strained. It was a history of conflict and controversy over the years. I'd watched Henry Kissinger do battle with Bill Rogers when Bill Rogers was at State. I'd watched the Kissinger-Schlesinger battles in the Ford administration, the Brzezinski-Vance battles in the Carter administration. The Reagan administration, I thought President Reagan was a good foreign policy president, but he had 7 national security advisors in 8 years. It was not exactly a bed of stability and smooth functioning teamwork. And we needed to avoid that, and we had a unique situation. Brent, of course, was in the position of serving again as National Security Advisor. Many of us thought he was going to keep doing it till he got it right, and we might as well help him along in that regard. But we had all served previously before. The night that I was named President Ford's Chief of Staff, Brent had been named National Security Advisor, George Bush had become the CIA Director, and a few months later I'd hired Jim Baker to manage the Ford the presidential campaign in '76. So well-established set of relationships, but working those relationships and serving the President as part of the National Security Council was clearly a major priority for me. Third, obviously, I wanted to focus inside the department on major policy decisions that affected the department, broad questions of strategy and force structure and so forth. Fourth, not necessarily in this order of priority, anytime we undertook military operations, I wanted to be able to drop everything else and focus specifically on my responsibilities being part of the chain of command from the President to the Secretary down to the sinks. Fifth, the budget, obviously a vital piece of business. The Secretary of Defense. I immersed myself in it the first year. Later on, I delegated big chunks of it to my deputy. The sixth area was Congress. I had special responsibilities there. I'd come from the Congress. I felt I had to take on the portfolio, really, of leading the charge with respect to the department's relationship with the Congress. Seventh was the press, sort of the public face, if you will, of the department. And eighth was a general category that I'll call civilian-military relationships. My general view, and this probably is where Goldwater-Nichols clearly had an impact, my general view was that that hadn't always been a smooth relationship, that there were periods when there had been conflict between the civilians in the department and the uniformed services. A lot of controversy generated by the way that relationship had worked or not worked previously. Oftentimes in the past, I'd found the JCS would be at odds on a policy position inside the administration with the office of the Secretary. And I wanted to try to avoid all those things, and I saw my role in part as managing that relationship between the civilians and the military. And clearly the link between myself as Secretary and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs was crucial in that regard in terms of determining how that relationship would function or not function. And in other areas, obviously, if those were going to be my priorities, there had to be certain things I wasn't going to do. And it was important to know what those were as well, too, that I was going to delegate to others. Care and feeding of service secretaries. I was clearly going to spend some time with the service secretaries. I don't mean to suggest that they didn't play an important role or that I didn't spend a lot of time with them. But the primary responsibility, if you will, of sort of the day-to-day care and feeding of service secretaries went to my deputy, Don Atwood. Details of the budget preparation after the first year, the domestic use of forces, oil spills, riots, hurricanes. I wanted somebody else to worry about how we use the force in those areas. Procurement reform, big issue, very important, but I didn't have much background in it, and again, had an outstanding deputy in Don Atwood, came from General Motors, and we carved that out as a major area of responsibility for Don as well. Clearly, this puts you in the position of having to recruit first-class people if you're going to delegate a lot of authority to them. And in this respect, again, I need to come back and say a word about the President. If you can choose a commander-in-chief, by all means choose a good one. Choose one that has the set of experiences that George Bush had, ranging from his own experience as a naval pilot in World War II to CIA director, vice president, ambassador to China and the United Nations. Pick one who cares a lot about the department and its people, and one who will give you the authority and then back you up so you can do the job he asked you to do. And clearly, in every respect, that's the way that President Bush operated. With respect to the appointments in the department, the key was to be able to replace, I think, 39 out of 44 from the time I first arrived within a matter of months. And the President, I believe, made 2 recommendations during my time there. Both of them were superb, and other than that, I had a free hand to do what I needed to do in the personnel area. And this became a factor, again, as we got into the relationship with the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Powell. Clearly, one of the first and most important decisions I had to make was who I wanted to recommend to the President to serve as Chairman. And Goldwater-Nichols, as Brent has mentioned already, hadn't really been implemented up to that point. That is to say that I think under Admiral Crowell, it was pretty much business as usual. He'd been there both before and after the enactment of Goldwater-Nichols. So the next individual through the process, the next chairman, clearly was going to be able to start with a relatively clean slate. It was not an automatic slam dunk that General Powell ought to be chairman. There were some arguments on the opposite side. A lot of people have forgotten now because he did such a superb job as chairman, but he was the most junior 4-star. He'd just received his 4th star when I arrived on the scene. He was the youngest ever to serve in that post. He'd just completed a 2-year tour where he'd been in the White House, and White House tours are not always assets from the standpoint of a military officer's career. In the end, I decided, really the night that I was named to be chairman, they're named to be secretary, that I wanted General Powell to be the chairman, and persuaded the President, General Scowcroft, that that was the right choice, and we went forward with it, and obviously I think it was a superb choice. I think history bears that out. Brent's covered the extent to which the Goldwater-Nichols Act allowed the chairman to function as the principal military advisor for me, for the NSC, and for the President. And I think in every respect, that was in fact the way we functioned during our tour there. I would not want to let the moment pass, though, without saying that there were other elements that were very important in terms of determining General Powell's effectiveness in that regard. Take Goldwater-Nichols, if you hadn't had someone with General Powell's experience and background and relationship with the rest of us, it might not have worked as well. You can only legislate so far, set up a structure and set up procedures, and then you're left to the quality of the individuals who serve and how they perceive their role and how they relate to others. Certainly of great significance in terms of General Powell's effectiveness as the advisor to the President, myself, and the rest of us had to do in part with the fact that he'd been the National Security Advisor for President Reagan and served in that capacity for a year and as the deputy for a year before that. That he'd been the military assistant to Secretary Weinberger. And those personal experiences of his made him, I think, even more effective in that capacity and in implementing the intent of Goldwater-Nichols. With respect to the presidential team itself, as Brent mentioned, he was an integral part of the team. We never really thought about military matters and military operations without him being present, and he was in every respect as effective as I think the press and the history books have recorded. I had an arrangement with the general that I wanted multiple sources of information coming up to me. I did not want to be in a position where I was relying on a sole source for the information flow on the military side or in the department generally. I also committed to him that in terms of using the force, I would always go through him, and any orders with respect to the chain of command, where I had the option, if I wanted to go straight to the sink, that I would, as a general proposition, always operate through the chairman. And for the most part, I think we honored that. I think the joint staff functions much better now as a result of Goldwater-Nichols, is a much stronger entity. Brent's described the details of that. From my perspective as secretary, while I obviously dealt with the services and dealt with the chief separately and independently and dealt with the service secretaries frequently, especially in operational matters, especially when it was time to use the force, when it was time to deploy troops and go to war, the joint staff became central to that process, working very closely with Paul, for example, who was the Undersecretary for Policy, but especially in terms of my role and responsibility as the Secretary, we relied very heavily on the joint staff for the day-to-day conduct of operations. Throughout Desert Storm, for example, in the Gulf crisis, we'd begin every morning with a joint briefing down in the command center by the Director of Intelligence and then the Director of Operations on the joint staff for General Powell and myself and our senior people. All during the course of those operations. The key point of contact, if you will, or interaction for me as the Secretary of Defense with the military was through the chairman and through the joint staff as opposed to the JCS. Sometimes I would go independently to the sinks, but always again with General Powell's awareness and knowledge I was doing. The joint staff became important in another respect too. The question of military assistance and the role of military assistance I think oftentimes doesn't get the attention it deserves, but if I was to reflect on my own time, I would argue that the role of the military assistance is absolutely vital. It's not provided for from a statutory standpoint. It's not part of the Goldwater-Nichols, but in a way Goldwater-Nichols influenced it. And when I arrived on the scene, I had as my principal military assistant one Bill Owens. Didn't do too bad later on, became vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Second was Admiral Joe Lopez, whom you'll hear from here later today. I'll talk a minute about Joe. Joe, of course, just finished his tour as Southern NATO commander. And General John Jumper, who's now the commander of all air forces in Europe. All three men were superb. They provided enormous assistance and help to me and were in all respects a vital part of the operation. I had a formal structural relationship with the chairman, ongoing relationship with various members of the joint staff, but that military assistant was oftentimes the first one you saw in the morning, the last one you saw at night, the source of a vast flow of information that came across my desk. They also had one other major responsibility, and that was the POAC. That is the Pentagon Officers Athletic Club. If you wanted to know what was really going on in the Department of Defense, you had to check in at the POAC a couple times a week. And so my military assistants always had the requirement to show up in the POAC to find out what the latest rumor was about what in fact was actually happening in the department. The important thing I think about Goldwater-Nichols and how it shaped things, again, and this isn't a requirement, but it set the tone for the way we operated, is the way I selected my military assistants. The traditional way had been in the past that when it was time to pick a new military assistant for the secretary, the services would submit recommendations and you would sit down and look at the recommendations from each of the services and pick one of them to be your military assistant. I didn't do that. I decided instead what I really wanted was joint staff experience, and what I needed in a military assistant was somebody who could in fact add another set of connections, if you will, between my office and the military, between my office and the joint staff. So when it was time for me to select a replacement for Bill Owens, I called in Tom Kelly, General Tom Kelly, Army 3-star, then the J3, the Director of Operations for the Joint Staff. And Tom, of course, was an Army officer, and I asked him to name for me the outstanding 1-star in the Army. I wanted to make him my military assistant. And Tom said, Lopez. I said, wait a minute, Joe's a sailor. He said, you want Lopez. So I called Joe in and interviewed him, and agreed that General Kelly's recommendation was the right one. And Joe was then on the Joint Staff. I took him off the Joint Staff, put him in the office as the military assistant to the Secretary. Within about 24 hours, the Iraqis invaded Kuwait, and I don't think he ever took a breath over the next 2 years. But the important thing for me as Secretary, given Goldwater-Nichols and given the operational requirements that we faced, was to have somebody off the Joint Staff as opposed to the recommendations of one of the services about who ought to be my assistant. I wanted somebody who was loyal to me, somebody who knew I personally had selected them, not somebody who was going to be an emissary from their home service to the Secretary's office. I did the same thing later on when Joe left to take over 6th Fleet, when I selected John Jumper, also off the Joint Staff. The SINC's role, obviously significantly enhanced by Goldwater-Nichols, and it was very helpful in peacetime, of course. One of the most valuable budget meetings we used to have every year was when I would sit down, our senior folks, with the SINCs and hear from them what their priorities were, and make certain that to the extent we could, we tried to work into the departmental budget presentations to the Hill the resources they felt they needed from the standpoint of their warfighting responsibilities. It was especially important, though, when we got into the operational phase again of using the force. With respect to Desert Storm, clearly General Schwarzkopf, given his role as SINC, was given veto power over the forces that went into the theater. No unit got to go. Nobody could deploy for Desert Storm, and a big problem we had was everybody wanted to go. But nobody could deploy without the SINC's sign-off and authority, and the chairman served as the enforcer of that proposition. If in fact somebody tried to get a unit into theater that hadn't been requested by the SINC, then that effort was denied. The service chiefs clearly continue to play vital roles, but primarily in terms of raising, training, and equipping the force. They do not have operational responsibility. They're not on the chain of command under Goldwater-Nichols for actually using the force, and that's important. I think in times past, based on what I've heard in prior administrations, we often ended up in a situation where military operations were conducted by units assembled more based upon the political need to manage the relationships between the services rather than what's the most effective unit we can use to achieve a particular objective. Desert One comes to mind as a classic example of how not to do it. The Goldwater-Nichols that had clarified those relationships between the President and the Secretary on the one hand and the SINC on the other, and within the department in terms of making the unified commanders key was very important. We didn't always get it right. Every once in a while something would slip through. I still am a little bit embarrassed that we used the F-117 stealth bomber in Panama. Panamanians had a really tough air defense network down there that we had to overcome. But for the most part, we were able to make sound decisions about what units were used and why. A perennial problem in Washington, anytime you use the force, is that everybody wants to get in the act, everybody wants to give advice, the State Department wants to select targets for the Air Force to hit, and you've got to avoid all of that, and that requires the President and the National Security Advisor to keep everybody else out of the chain of command in the other departments, and inside the Department of the Pentagon itself. You also have to work very hard to maintain the integrity of that chain of command, and Goldwater-Nichols clearly helps with all of that. Let me close. There are a lot of other things we could talk about by making just a couple of additional points. That as much as I'm an advocate of Goldwater-Nichols, let me offer a caution here, and that is that I don't think it is possible for the Congress, however wise it might be, however many hearings you want to hold, whatever amount of evidence you want to accumulate, it isn't possible for the Congress to legislate every nit and nat about how the Department of Defense is going to function. In the final analysis, once you've created the structure and identified responsibilities and granted authority, you're going to depend upon the quality and caliber of the people who fill those slots, how they view their jobs, what kind of leadership you get from the president, etc. I would argue that there were other factors that entered into how effective the civilians were in controlling the operation and the ability and the quality of military advice, how all of that functioned, that aren't in Goldwater-Nichols. Probably shouldn't be in Goldwater-Nichols. I'm not suggesting that should be included. Absolutely at the top of the list is the ability of the Secretary to hire and fire. I found it necessary on my watch to relieve a SINC and to relieve a member of the Joint Chiefs. Absolutely essential that the Secretary have that authority and that nothing be done to impede it. And it is, I would argue, at least as important as Goldwater-Nichols in reinforcing the notion of who's running the show and who's in fact in charge. The personality of the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs is obviously crucial. His relationship with the Secretary is vital. The relationship between the President and the other NSC types. The Deputies Committee, one of the great, I think, strengths of our operation during the Bush years was the evolution and development of what we call the Deputies Committee. I think an equivalent probably has been created in most administrations. Paul Wolfowitz can speak to that better than I can because he was usually my representative on the Deputies Committee. But it was also a place where the interagency process, the Deputy Secretary of State and Defense and NSC, Deputy NSC Advisor, Deputy Director of the CIA, and the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs got together. And oftentimes they met more often, spent more time together, and that was a forum for offering and developing military options that was at least as important as what the principals did, because we often took their product and then worked it and implemented their recommendations. Nothing about the Deputies Committee and the Goldwater-Nichols Act. I'm not advocating that there should be. My point only is that the success and effectiveness of an administration in dealing with these kinds of issues is affected by a lot of things. Goldwater-Nichols is obviously an important piece of the structure that you have to operate with, but all of these other items are equally important in terms of determining how effective an administration is. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Secretary. I'm grateful to both General Scowcroft and Secretary Cheney for coming to visit Syracuse. Secretary Cheney has been a regular participant in a variety of national security studies efforts that we've done in the Washington, D.C. area, but this is the first time we've been successful in bringing him upstate New York. It's great to see you. General Scowcroft, again, thank you very much for your participation in the events. We're going to take a brief 5-minute break and then convene the panel discussion that will be moderated by Paul Wolfowitz and with Secretary White as well. 5 minutes. Well, again, good morning. This afternoon, we're going to have an opportunity to speak with several current and previous operational commanders. General Jim McCarthy, the former Deputy Commander-in-Chief of Europe, is going to moderate a panel with Admiral Joe Lopez, who you heard about just a few moments ago from Secretary Cheney, and introduced him far better than I ever could, who was just recently relieved as the NATO Southern Commander. And is here with us today to discuss that particular experience, as well as General Mike Carnes, who was the director of the Joint Staff during the Panama and Desert Shield, Desert Storm activities, as well as General Joseph Hoare, who was the Commander-in-Chief of Central Command during the Somali campaign particularly. But this morning we're going to continue our activity or discussion with some of the civilian leadership at the time, serving several spans of time before, during, and after the enactment of Goldwater-Nichols. I mentioned earlier that we are co-sponsoring this particular symposium with Dr. John White, who is on the faculty at the Kennedy School now, but had previously served as a Deputy Secretary of Defense in the first term of the Clinton administration. Previously had been the chairman of the Commission on Roles and Missions, had been the principal author of a Center for Strategic and International Studies report back in the mid-1980s that formed the foundation of the Goldwater-Nichols Act, or at least certainly helped fuel the debate at that time. And previous to that had served in the Carter administration as an Assistant Secretary of Defense. So his span throughout all that period has been able to observe a variety of different changes in the operational conduct of both the civilian leadership as well as the military leadership in the Department of Defense. In addition, the panel will be moderated by Paul Wolfowitz, who himself comes to this particular challenge with an enormous background in the periods of time before, during, and after enactment of this act. He served as an Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian activities, as well as later as Ambassador to Indonesia. Came back to the Department of Defense in the Bush administration as the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, and served in that capacity during the Panama and Desert Storm activities as well. He is now the Dean at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, and I'm proud to say a very prominent partner in the Maxwell-Seiss Partnership for the national security effort that I'm asked to direct. And so he is not only a tremendous professional associate, but also a very close personal friend. We turn over the proceedings to Paul Wolfowitz to moderate the panel.
Thank you, Sean. It really is a pleasure to be part of this Seiss-Maxwell partnership, and it's a stunning array of people that Sean has brought out for this symposium, and I think nothing could be more distinguished than this morning's panel. It's been great to be at this reunion with General Scowcroft and my old boss, Dick Cheney. I even learned things I never knew before, like how Admiral Lopez got his job as military assistant, and I hope it's clear to have a Army General recommend a Navy Admiral for that job is a true triumph of jointness. Before we open up to questions from the audience, let me first ask John White to make a few comments or ask a question. John has the distinction not only of having helped to formulate Goldwater-Nichols in an earlier capacity, but I guess unlike the two speakers this morning, has experienced how Goldwater-Nichols worked in a different administration. So John, would you share your thoughts with us?
Thank you, Paul. Let me make a few comments. First of all, I agree with everything that was said by General Scowcroft and Secretary Cheney, both before and after having worked in the Pentagon, both before and in the White House before and then in the Pentagon afterwards. When I returned to be concerned with these kinds of issues when I was appointed chairman of the Roles and Missions Commission, I was truly startled by the changes that had taken place, almost all of them for the better in terms of the way the department operated and how Goldwater-Nichols had affected it. The second point I'd make is just a brief anecdote that I think is symbolic. We had the practice, and I think Secretary Cheney did as well, of meeting every morning of the secretary, the deputy secretary, the chairman, and the vice chairman, and you could set up what was to be done during the day, and you could organize. That generally could not have been done before because of the diffusion of responsibilities, and as Secretary Cheney mentioned, the problem of having so many people and so many people reporting to the secretary. Let me switch gears and give you my top 5 of things that we ought to do going on from here. These are not necessarily changes in the law per se, but things that I think are on our agenda for further improvement. And I've tried to rank these, at least in terms of my sense of their importance. First is better resource management, and by that I mean largely implementing the concepts in the Revolution in Business Affairs laid out in the QDR and other documents, recent documents provided by reviews under Secretary Cohen. Second, we talked a good deal last week about the concern of civilian control, and I think we had a consensus. The issue is not civilian control in the sense that the military wants to usurp civilian control. The issue is making sure the civilians are competent in terms of providing advice to the Secretary and to the President that is required. That's largely one of building a professional staff, and there I think we have a lot of improvements that we need to make, not only in OSD but throughout the department. So I would list forms of civil service reform and other improvements in the training and professionalization of that staff. Third is joint officer management, which I think is central to Goldwater-Nichols and has not been attended to by either the civilian or military leadership to the extent it should be, including myself. Fourth is to expand the joint capability. We know that in the Pentagon, jointness is politically correct, and we know that in the field largely it works, but I think in terms of doctrine and exercises and emphasis, there is something more to be done. And finally, reaching more afield, I would suggest that a good many of the principles in Goldwater-Nichols ought to be implemented with respect to the rest of the national security apparatus in the government. We've learned in these recent era when we must rely on people from Justice and AID and a whole set of other agencies that in fact they are not fundamentally equipped, or do they think in terms of their roles overseas, and that's something that has to be done. And in fact, I think there is a danger that if you don't do that, we continually return to the Department of Defense and to our military to ask them to do things that in fact in many instances in terms of infrastructure building, health care, and a whole civil order and a whole set of other things ought to be done by domestic agencies. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I think I'll take the privilege of the chair and ask the first question to all three of our panelists, and that is on this question of civilian control. I think General Scowcroft made the reference to the fact that the deadlock of the old system created an opening for a great expansion of civilian control through the creation of the whiz kids. And there is a line of criticism. I can't ask this question terribly well because I guess I don't agree with it myself, but it's logical enough in one level that says, well, Goldwater-Nichols has enormously strengthened the military, so what has it done to civilian control of the military? Hasn't it perhaps weakened it? And perhaps, maybe to put an even extra point on this question, particularly to Secretary Cheney, you had probably the most powerful chairman working, General Powell working for you, the most powerful chairman either before or since. How did the combination of Goldwater-Nichols and a very powerful chairman affect your ability or the President's ability to exercise civilian control over the military? And that's really to all three of you.
Well, I've heard that comment from time to time. I don't think it's a zero-sum game. I mean, it's not as though if you have a powerful chairman or a powerful joint staff arrangement, you necessarily have weak civilian operation. I would argue just the contrary. In fact, that the stronger, more effective, higher quality military advice you get, the tighter you've got the chain of command, the basic ability to function, to bring advice up the chain and to transmit orders down the chain, the better the civilians are going to do. And I mean, if I was, I suppose you could go out and hire weak people. Don't hire the strongest people you can find, but if that was the rule, Paul, you wouldn't have been working for me. So, as I recall, you probably at least as much as General Powell used to refuse to take no for an answer. You'd come in occasionally and argue with me, and I'd throw you out of my office, and you'd be back the next day arguing again, the same point. Usually you were right, though, and I appreciate it. It was a great asset. But I think with respect to General Powell, too, I went out and found the best individual I could find to serve in that capacity. We had the confluence of events that produced what I think was a very positive result. I look back on my time there as having been reasonably successful, and it was because of the combination of things: the President, the National Security Advisor, relationships among principals, the quality of the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the fact of Goldwater-Nichols. All of those things came together to make us effective. And I think if you put somebody weak in, as chairman of the Joint Chiefs. You're clearly not going to get as good a result out of Goldwater-Nichols, no matter how many times you dot the I's and cross the T's.
Well, like Dick, I think it's a mixed bag. First of all, I think the issue of civilian control, as it is generally thought of by the average American citizen, is a shibboleth, and that the American military is so deeply imbued instinctively in the notion of civilian control, of following the Constitution, of doing things right, that I think any advertent move in that direction is maybe Hollywood, but it certainly isn't true. But I think there are some problems, and one of them struck me in the difference between the Ford administration and the Bush administration. In the Ford administration, virtually every senior civilian in the national security structure had had military service of one kind or another. They understood at least the rudiments of what the military was all about, and that no matter how well you planned, you knew things were going to screw up if you actually had to use military force. Nothing went the way it was supposed to. That's pretty well gone now. And the danger of that is that sitting around in the National Security Council, there may be only one person who has now an understanding of the military in that gut sense, and what they can do and what they can't do, and the kinds of cautionary things that you have to look out for. So it puts a bigger burden on the chairman, and I think that is something of a problem. But I don't think that problem has become worse since Goldwater-Nichols, because before there was no military advice in the White House. I'd like to mention one other thing, and a lot of this comes down in the end to people. I'm a firm believer that good people can make even a bad organization work, but poor people are not going to make even a good organization work. And I think one of the changes has been a subtle one, and that's between the Secretary of Defense and the chairman. That is always a complicated relationship, especially when they come into the White House. Here is a chairman who works for the secretary, giving his military judgment to the president. That's a tough thing to do, and when you have a more powerful chairman, it becomes even more complicated. And I must say, I used to sit back and watch Dick and Colin, and they were marvelous. I mean, they had us outvoted every time. It was really great. Dick never pushed his authority, never made it look like Colin had to say what Dick had just said, or me too, or anything like that. Colin was free to speak out, but Colin himself sort of implicitly recognized the difference between he himself and the secretary. That's an art, and I think Goldwater-Nichols maybe has made that a little more difficult to manage skillfully.
I think that's right, Brent. I think it does take a lot more energy on both people, but I think, as you indicate, the result of that, in that case, and certainly in the case with Bill Perry and Chalian, I think now has meant a stronger team, because they have spent more time doing that. Also, I think in terms of actual increase in responsibility, there are some things there. Dick Cheney mentioned the Deputies Committee, which is a very good vehicle, which adds strength to the process. I think, Paul, you, in your case, as has evolved over time, were a far more powerful player than was true in the old days, that is pre-Goldwater-Nichols, and had access and required a good deal more information from the Joint Staff that you would not have gotten earlier in terms of contingency planning and other activities, and I think that's important. So I think the main concern here, and as General Scowcroft said, this is a shibboleth about the military. The main concern is making sure we have the quality people over time and the quality staff support over time that we need in the department in order to advise the Secretary and provide him with independent advice in terms of what he has to decide, and more importantly, and most importantly, what he has to provide to the Commander-in-Chief.
Sean, you said you wanted to...
Just one comment. I remember when I first came to the Pentagon in 1964, they had just finished a big fight, speaking of civilian control, over whether or not anybody in OSD could look at the PSYOP. I mean, it sounds incredible today, but it's true. Civilians were not allowed to look at the PSYOP.
Just to pick up on a point I think that General Scowcroft mentioned earlier of that people in large measure will make the organization no matter how it's organized or legislated. And I think to capitalize again on a point Secretary White made, of the quality of the staff, at least among that second rung below the senior leadership. One of the things I find most discouraging about the current process, whether it's in the last administration or this one, it's not an issue that's partisan of Democrat or Republican, is over time, in the last 10 to 15 years, we've erected enough impediments, restrictions for civilians to seek the opportunity to serve in the public sector in a way that has become so onerous as to almost preclude anyone who is rational in their consideration of future professional opportunities from choosing to elect to go into a position of public service, particularly those that require the appointment of the President of the United States and confirmation by the United States Senate. We'll have an opportunity later in the week here to talk a little bit with some current and former congressional staff about how that particular process has grown over time. But it certainly has gotten to the stage where the period of time in which civilians serve in appointed positions is averaging no more than 18 to 24 months, and the period of time it takes in order to clear individuals through the process to seek those kinds of positions is the better end of 9 to 12 months in order to assure that. I led a very charmed experience. I came in within 6 weeks after Secretary Cheney was confirmed, in part because I had a financial statement that was the most uninteresting thing that could be ever imagined. It was all zeros. And I had no conflict of interest by virtue of having been a captive member of the Senate staff for many years prior to that, and a future boss who was willing to trust the fact that with that open page agenda, he was willing to take that risk. That's generally not the circumstances. And as a result, the nature of the restrictions for individuals, both currently and post-employment restrictions, are so onerous now that this may indeed be one of the features of a future amendment to Goldwater-Nichols that could in turn become very beneficial.
Let me, if I can, just follow up on Brent's point over here as well too, and probably for the audience explain what the PSYOP is. It's the operating plan, obviously, for using nuclear weapons, but to show you the distinction between 1964, when civilians weren't allowed to see the PSYOP, and post-Goldwater-Nichols, during the Bush administration, we did a complete revision of the entire PSYOP as a joint project between Paul's office and people working for the deputy undersecretary for policy, the civilian side, and the joint staff, and fundamentally revised and modified that plan in major ways. And again, I think Goldwater-Nichols contributed to that in the sense the role of the joint staff, the ability of the joint staff to work with the civilian side of the House to dig into what were one of the most sacred cows in the entire department.
Again, that is a terrific example of what you said earlier. It's not a zero-sum game. If General Powell were here, I think he would say that if it weren't for the civilians' ability to get into those plans, he as chairman would not have had as much influence over the PSYOP. And I've always thought, in many ways, the example of Harry Truman, who had serving under him as Secretary of State Dean Acheson, one of the most intimidating intellects around, and as Secretary of Defense George Marshall, again, one of the most impressive, intimidating, awe-inspiring public servants we've ever had. And this former senator from Missouri, was not intimidated by them. He realized he was the president, and he realized that he was a stronger president, I think, for having strong individuals working for them. There is another model of management which says, I don't want anyone who can outshine me, and I think that doesn't work very well. Let's open it up to questions from the audience. I'm sure there are a lot. As General Scowcroft said, this is an audience with experts and veterans and people probably with a few wounds on their backs from the old process or from the new one. There are some mics, one on each side and one in the middle. It's always tough to go first, but here we have a volunteer. Good.
I'm the class volunteer for going first.
Maybe say your name and where you're from.
Colonel Steve Shook, Army, Joint Staff, Chief of War Plans. My question is for the entire panel, is everyone here has said basically that Goldwater-Nichols has been a profound success, did what it was intended to do, and without a whole lot of bad unintended consequences. My question goes back to really what Undersecretary White brought up, which is the civilian side, interagency, intergovernmental side that hasn't been addressed, and that essentially our national security strategy still is a DOD document, DOD focus. Will it take legislation to better bring in commerce, state, and judicial so that we have a total governmental posture and capability and abilities to conduct national security strategy? And second question, in that same light, we look the same as we did post-Cold War, pre-Cold War, post-Cold War. Our regional sinks are out there. We don't have enough forces to meet the needs of all the regional sinks. Do we then need to look at maybe being just a capabilities-based force that meets the needs of the national security strategy versus trying to meet the needs of individual sinks? Thank you, sirs.
Two small questions.
You go first.
That's the way it always was. Well, I think John's comment about reforming the rest of the national security structure is a very good one. I'm probably slightly apprehensive about it because I think it's a delicate machine. But I do believe in at least one part of it, and that is that other elements which do play some role in national security, commerce, justice, for example, are not organized in a way that they can participate usefully. They have different ways of looking at things. Their secretaries are not staffed. Dick, you probably have more knowledge of that than I do. But we would bring them in on issues where they were definitely involved. Frequently, for example, the Attorney General was in. They need internally to have their structures overhauled so that they can, in fact, participate. In many ways, they're like the old Joint Chiefs of Staff. So I think we need some help there. One of the fundamental things we need to try to do better is general long-range thinking and planning. And specifically, we need a better way to organize the government for economics. Now, this administration set up a joint economic council as a counterpart to the National Security Council. And my impression, and maybe John wants to come on to that, is that it maybe was a pretty good idea and maybe worked fairly well as long as Bob Rubin was there, that it didn't work out. Managing economics is much more difficult than managing national security. National security, there are only a few really prime players: defense, state, CIA, and that's, you know, that's a pretty collegial club. And one of my hesitations about expanding it more is that you might lose the collegiality by adding people whose mental orientation is very different. But in economics, everybody thinks they have a part of it. Almost every agency thinks it has a part of it. And each administration figures out a different way to organize decision-making on economics, and as near as I can see, none of them has worked.
Let me just make a brief comment about the economics and the long-term planning. I think both are true, as Brent has said. Secondly, while I think, as you indicated, the Economic Council worked, particularly when you had a strong leader like Bob Rubin, as time went on and these issues got more intertwined and more complicated, we used, to some extent, the NSC device for dealing with them, and it was clearly an uncomfortable and difficult way to do it. But if you're going to sit down and deal with the president going to China or the president going to Russia, half or more of these issues are now economic. And you have to have some vehicle by which to do that, and you have to have people with a familiarity within the bureaucracy to be able to deal with it and to deal with their national security counterparts, and we're not there yet.
And at the risk of getting someone mad at me, I would have to say in my government experience, there's no agency that's more arrogant and less willing to coordinate with the rest of the government than the Department of the Treasury.
And I left out Treasury, I should. Yeah.
And I had the experience when I was working for George Shultz at State Department. We had an issue with the Philippines. It was a matter of a vote in the IMF that was purely political because the loan was going to be approved no matter how the United States voted. And even though Shultz was the Secretary of State and a former Secretary of Treasury, the Treasury Department decided this is our vote, we'll do it our way, and we'll coordinate with no one. And of course the results were pretty bad. I would add one other, though, to the list, and that is I think the whole area of terrorism, which has the potential at some point in the future to become terrorism with weapons of mass destruction, is a place where this organizational gap could really hurt us very, very badly. And that we're in some confusion even at a theoretical level as to whether it's a law enforcement problem or it's a deterrence defense problem. And I think the gaps between justice on the one hand and other parts of the U.S. government are pretty severe. And I haven't heard anyone yet really come up with a solution for it. I was on the Brown Commission to look at the roles and missions of the intelligence community, and we identified this as an important problem, but when it came to figuring out an organizational solution, we dumped it in the hands of the National Security Advisor and said he should chair a committee. And with all respect to National Security Advisors, I think when you solve an organizational problem with a committee chaired by the National Security Advisor, you've admitted you don't know what to do.
So it's like the old saying, Leroy don't want the ball. One anecdote, I think Paul's absolutely right about terrorism. When we were in office, when we came in, the first drug czar had just been appointed, and Congress had set him up, and he was called drug czar. Well, it was an individual, and he had some money, and that was it. And he had no structure, he had no organization, he had no way to make himself felt, much less bring all of the other warlords who were involved, like Justice, Treasury, and so on, to heal. The first one was Bill Bennett. And so I went to Bill and I said, look, you need help. There's no way you can cut yourself a share of power in the government this way. And I offered to lend him the structure of the NSC to use its process and you know, force people in the NSC structure into our debating system and so on. It didn't work very well, partly because he didn't know how to do it, and partly it was alien to a lot of the people because they had never worked it this way. The FBI's, Treasury, but there's definitely a need for some, both on drugs still, although it's better now, but terror is certainly part. And as I look at the latest NSC directive on terror, to me it's like your first organizational chart of the Pentagon you looked at. It's a nightmare.
Everybody has passed on commenting on the Congress, which I think was part of your question as well too. And that's an area of special concern from my perspective. I really sense that we are moving away from having a Congress that really understands and is involved with and has a kind of a deep interest in these issues that I think are warranted. It's as though once the Cold War ended, then it became possible to run for office and serve as a member of Congress without ever having to address those questions about the U.S. role in the world and national security matters. It just hasn't been on the radar screen in the last 3 elections now. And so then you see some of the consequences of that. Percentage I heard the other day, some 40% of new members of Congress arrive in Washington don't have passports, never been outside the United States. Or a recent comment by one of our congressional leaders to the effect that he'd been to Europe once, he'd seen all there was to see, and there was no need to go back. So the problem is, I think you've got a Congress that is not especially knowledgeable about, nor at this point involved in these kinds of issues, and you start from a base of some ignorance. It doesn't make the task downtown any easier.
Let me make 2 comments about that, because I think that's right. There are 2 problems generally in the Congress in this regard. One is that a lot of this happens through inadvertence. That is, people just don't think through what the implications are for trying to manage the department if they go directly to military people. There was a proposal when the legislation for the Quadrennial Defense Review was on the Hill when we were first discussing it up there, by 2 very knowledgeable and very responsible senators, one Republican and one Democrat, who proposed that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff create his own independent defense budget outside the advice of the Secretary and present it directly to the Congress. They simply had not thought through the implications of what they were talking about. And once we worked through it, we worked our way through it. The second issue is a partisan issue. That is, to the extent that the parties are different in the executive and the Congress, I worry about whether or not some people in the Congress see civilian control as them to the military as opposed to them to the executive branch and then to the military.
Captain Dennis Haynes, United States Navy, Head Submarine Manpower and Training. With the discussion of readiness that's going on right now, what do you think the responsibility of Goldwater-Nichols is in making sure that the military is ready? And if it doesn't have that responsibility, how should it be changed so that it does keep us from having a readiness problem again?
Well, obviously I think it would be my expectation that to the extent that there are readiness problems with the services, that it would show up, especially from the perspective of the sinks, as they do their planning and exercises and deploy the force. If you're sending naval units to sea with a significant number of vacancies on board, you got a readiness problem. If you, but it doesn't reside only in the sinks, obviously, or from the perspective of those elements touched by Goldwater-Nichols. I think the services have a prime responsibility in this area. And to the extent that you look to the service secretaries and the service chiefs to be and have the lead responsibility for recruiting and raising and training and equipping the force, which I think we still do to a large extent, I would think that that's the prime area where an effort's needed. If there's a readiness problem out there today, I don't know that it is so much generated by internal difficulties inside the department as it is by a failure to provide resources or by forcing the services to have to choose between long-term investment and short-term readiness requirements. Sooner or later you get into difficulty, I think primarily because you deny the department the resources they need to do the job. It's not to say everything's perfect downtown or they always get it right or there aren't other elements involved, but I think right now we're in a situation where we do have a readiness problem. I think a lot of that's driven by the lack of effective civilian leadership, meaning White House and Congress.
Let me just say a word about being ready versus readiness. I agree with what Dick says about readiness, but being ready is different. Being ready is focusing on longer range issues of strategy and force structure. And Goldwater-Nichols has helped a lot there. the whole JROC process and so on helps enormously. We still have a long way to go. There's still a built-in tendency either to let technology run things and technology determining weapons system, but the other way around, the other side of that coin is that technology still tends to be squeezed into traditional service roles. And somehow we need to do a better job in longer range, out-of-the-box thinking about the nature of combat in the future and how we start to prepare for it. Weapon systems take longer and longer and longer to gestate and to be deployed. And the environment is changing faster and faster. So projecting out 11 years now, which is I think about the average, isn't it, Sean, that it takes a major weapon system to get to deployment, that's a long way into the future in the world we have now. It wasn't in 1955 or 60 or 65. It was a fairly predictable world. It certainly isn't now, and somehow we have to come to grips better with how we can adapt ourselves to the world in a realistic way, and I don't think we've found that. And certainly in the NSC, I must confess to pretty complete failure in terms of doing significant long-range planning.
You know, just to punctuate a point I think that Secretary Cheney made, that this, by and large, this issue is that of a service responsibility, to recruit, train, and equip the force, no question. The difficulty, though, is that at this point, I think, and given General Scowcroft your observation of how long it takes in order to respond to what are requirements that are generated by unified commanders, and they're, by definition of the way Goldwater-Nichols is put together, unified commanders are to look at the near term, the immediate, the present, today kind of problems in terms of what forces are required to deal with the conflict, the crisis, whatever situation may emerge. And that's the reason I found those sessions that you convened, Mr. Secretary, a couple times a year with all the unified commanders so beneficial, was to reconcile those differences of what the unified commanders were insisting upon to be provided today, immediately. And when you added all those up, they exceeded the national debt by 2. And as a result, it became grossly apparent that the requirements and the demands that they sought upon the ability of the services to provide and the resource wherewithal to accomplish those tasks was something that needed reconciliation. Now, it also gave them an opportunity to chew my ankle a bit as controller for why I wasn't providing the resources necessary to do that. But it was always a very healthy way of reconciling both of those dynamics, and to some extent, it doesn't happen often enough.
I think one of the problems that Goldwater-Nichols has brought is a different kind of tension. And as Sean points out, our chief strategists in a way now are the sinks. The sink's interest is now. 4 years from now, that guy will be retired. So he wants it now ready. That is as opposed to the services whose role is to train and equip. But they're doing it in a very different kind of perspective. The Air Force may know what kind of airplanes it would like, but if the Air Force plans out this way, without the sink's overall view of what it's going to take him to have a joint fighting outfit, you have a huge gap, and I think we have not figured out how to bridge that.
Please.
Gentlemen, my name is Jean Holzman. I've worked in the Navy R&D community for a long time. Excuse me. You've all talked about the challenges within the department itself, of the structural unwieldiness of the department, the challenge of getting good people to work in the department in that kind of environment. My question is, if there was a feeling that the department need to be looked at as far as its organizational structure or streamlined, how would we go about it? We certainly would not prefer to have legislation to that regard, but on the other hand, Mr. Secretary, I understand that the press of the job that you have makes it very difficult to evaluate your own organization while you're there. So would there be a recommendation of how you would do that, to look inward to the department and try to streamline itself for more effective operations?
Fix the organization chart, in other words. Well, there's almost a continuous process in Washington, I think, of studies of what our future requirements are going to be. We've just got a new one started here in the last few weeks, chaired by Warren Redmond, former Senator Redmond, sponsored, I think, by the Speaker and the Secretary and so forth. I've participated in a number of them myself, one recently, the American Enterprise Institute, for example. There's no shortage of ideas and concepts out there that need to be addressed. There has been. It's difficult, I think, for most of us who move into those jobs and actually take on responsibility to conclude that you're going to spend all your time there on these kinds of problems. I mean, they have defied solution up till now. You can tamper a bit with it at the edges. I worked, for example, in the intelligence area when I was secretary and did make some fairly significant organizational changes there, but that was because I had a special interest in intelligence and then served on the committee and so forth. But it is very, very hard to know where to start, and I'm not certain at this point that I could say that there's any one particular structure that's necessarily better than any others. I came away again with a feeling that the chart wasn't nearly as important as were the relationships among people, personalities that were involved, a set of priorities, the kind of guidance that we gave. And as Brent mentioned earlier, good people can find workarounds to make the organization do what needs to be done, and that's probably more important than the actual structure itself. That's my bias. I'm sure there are other views that to the contrary. I'm always skeptical of people, especially from outside, who look at it and say, well, gee, organize it like a business. It's not a business, it's the Department of Defense. We got a different set of responsibilities and requirements than anybody else does. There's a lot of redundancy there. We used to argue that half the defense budget was wasted. The problem was we didn't know which half. There's a lot of redundancy built in. You've got probably got officers and billets that you don't really need in peacetime. But when the balloon goes up and you've got to go to war, you're going to want that leadership and you're going to want trained individuals there. And I'd just as soon have a little bit of redundancy built in a peacetime organization. Looks inefficient, doesn't work all that smoothly, but when you need them, you've got them to do the chore, the task at hand. So you're always going to have the problem that it's the Department of Defense. It's not Walgreens, it's not HUD. It's huge, it's complex, it's different, it's got very special responsibilities and requirements. And to some extent, those are the things that drive the structure that's there now.
I'd like to invite John White to comment on this point, because during your tenure as Deputy Secretary, you were a very strong advocate for a unique civil service reform initiative for the Department of Defense Civilian Corps.
Well, I think what Dick said is exactly right. These outside groups, we've all been on them, we've chaired them and so on, are useful. They keep pressure on the system. The second point, though, that he made, which I think is more important, when you're there, you've only got 15% of your time or so that's discretionary. You can work on civil service reform, you can work on intelligence reform, but you can't work on both, or you can't work on three. You just won't get there from here. So it's a very difficult issue, and there's no panacea. There's no device, I don't think, by which you create these changes, and there's no process.
I might just one brief comment. When I became Undersecretary for Policy, I reorganized the policy operation. When I left, it was reorganized after me. I think the organization makes a difference. I think we got it right. Forgive me, but I think the next reform was wrong. And the principle that I was working on was, among other things, since we sort of handle the foreign relations of the Defense Department, the people at the assistant level spend an enormous amount of time traveling. And one of the two simple principles of my reorganization was make sure the travel responsibilities are divided up more or less equally among the three main subordinates, or you'll never see the person that really should be in charge. But the real thing I draw from this is I don't think somebody I mean, I can have my judgment about the reorganization, but I think basically the managers got to organize in a way that they think is for them. And I think one danger in all these commissions and all these recommendations is a lot of them turn up in legislation that end up hamstringing you and putting artificial constraints on how many appointees you can have at such and such a level, or how many flag officers you can have in such and such a place. And it seems to me that in this balance between people and organization, as General Scowcroft said, people are the thing that can bring in good people is the most important thing you can do, and the thing that empowers those good people to figure out solutions that work for them, I think, is the next most important. And after that, work on the organization chart, or else just get a bigger table to hold the whole thing. Yes, sir. I think there? No.
There's one over here.
There. There's someone around the corner. I'll get you next.
Joe David from Army Materiel Command. I heard what you said. I understand that in peacetime we need to have an organization that will build leaders and people to follow on. But people at all levels of defense are being asked to relook everything we do, to scrape every bottom dollar, to free it up for modernization, to free it up for readiness. It's kind of hard to hear that it's too hard to fix the top levels. I mean, we've got secretariats at DOD, as well as the uniform side. We have secretariats at each of the departments, as long as they're military parts. It looks like there's an awful lot of room that we could save some money and move it somewhere else, instead of making folks try to rethink how much Class 9 they can order that month, repair parts, or whether we can afford to do something else. Just like your comments on that, sir.
I was thinking about abolish the civilian Secretary of the Navy and Assistant Secretary structure. Well, there may well be. I can't argue against that. I don't know that you're going to save all that money. We had 44 presidential level appointments to fill. And from one perspective, the perspective you talk about is a wasted resources. You say you really need 44. Couldn't he do it with 30, 20? Well, possibly. On the other hand, perspective as secretary, those are about the only jobs I could change. And I had 2 million duty people and 1 million reservists and 1 million civilians, and I didn't think 44 was an excessive number that do what I wanted them to do. So there's a bit of a there. The political requirements too. I mean, the fact of the matter is, you respond to the United States. The Congress has the authority to authorize and appropriate funds for the purposes for which the department's organized. And I got to tell you, there are things the Congress does that drive you nuts when you're secretary. Bases, you know, right now we're clearly in a situation where we still have too many bases. We ought to close bases. We had a base closing commission that worked pretty well during the Bush years. And now that whole process has come to a halt. The secretary no longer has the authority to close bases. He can't get the authority out of the Congress. The Congress doesn't trust the administration. And so we're dead in the water. We're not closing any bases. Congress is wedded to district. They're going to make oftentimes parochial decisions. We ought to contract out a lot more than we do. We got a system of depots around the country that makes no sense at all from the standpoint of efficiency and manpower cost. They're all operating at 40 or 50% of capacity. We ought to shut them down and contract that stuff out, and we'd save millions and millions of dollars. But the political system produces a result that's flawed. You can't get Congress off the dime to go let you deal with issues. And the fix, well, you know, you just keep working at it. You know, this week you try to close this base. Next week you'll try to undertake John's civil service reform. You just have to keep chipping away at it. And as inefficient as it is, it still works amazingly well when you think about it. And certainly produced significant results in the U.S. over the 20th century. Let's get it right. Lots of times we made the operations didn't all go smoothly. We probably did waste a lot of money. But given the players, actors, and the people that are involved in the process, I'm not sure there's any one individual I know is smart enough to let them have the authority to fix it all by themselves. You're always, as long as you do, it's always going to be complicated.
I think there's one thing we need to remember, and that is We live within a constitutional structure, which means we're never going to be as efficient as we ought to be, because we have a Congress and an executive. Paul and I serve on a defense board now, and the papers you have to fill out are essentially saying, we know you're a crook. Now, we want to make sure that you cheat, lie, and steal in this job. You know, that's congressman mandated stuff we have to do. The same thing in procurement, the same thing in the structure of the department. The Congress can work its way best for its own interests in defense if defense is centralized. You know, if they can play off one service against the other, one group against the other, that's the way they get power and authority. And you know, it's always going to be that way. And so we have to try to work around it. And I'm saying you're not absolutely right. You are. But I think we ought not to do it fundamentally to save money. Organizational structures, I don't think you're going to save much in the end. What we ought to do it for is to reduce the friction in the system, to be able to get answers faster and better.
Secretary Cohen formed up a group, I guess, a year ago to look at the Defense Reform Initiative. As a matter of fact, Arnold Panaro is one of the folks in the audience here who chaired that particular initiative. And in my assessment, it, along with many other attempts at management reform, which, as Secretary Cheney suggested, you've got to chip away at a little bit at a time. This particular initiative that was just launched a year ago will have that same effect on a variety of individual kinds of initiatives, but something has got to be done consistently, because in the end, I think General Scowcroft's point is exactly right. There are so many different ways with 535 members who all think they're Secretary of Defense instead of the incumbent of whoever that is at the time. They each have an opinion over the reform and what's a setback. And the definition of those two depends on where you sit and how interested or vested you are in any of those individual moves towards improving the management. Because for one individual who claims it's an improvement, others would argue that it's a terrible detriment. It could be the identical initiative. And so as a consequence, trying to meld that through, you almost have to take that incremental, one at a time kind of approach and be dogged about it in seeing those kinds of changes made.
Yes, sir. Wait, Mel, there's one questioner first, then I'll get you next.
That's okay. Hi, I'm Kathy Miller. I'm with the Office of the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Financial Management and Comptroller. And I'd like to take the discussion back to the civil service reform. Could you describe for us the types of capabilities that you would envision in a more professionalized civil service? And how do you think the department should drive to obtain those capabilities within the civil service workforce?
Sorry.
Sure, hobby roast.
He only doesn't tell
It's
you.
yours,
Yeah, you only
John.
It's yours. I think we have the beginnings of a good model for what needs to be done in the way we manage our military, our uniformed services. I wouldn't use that as a template, but I would begin there. I think we need more mobility, both lateral and upward mobility. I think we need more professional education. I think we need to make sure that as we provide professional education, then get to rotate in various positions. I think we need to spend some time recognizing that the civilians in the government need to be praised, awarded for what it is they do. They're enormously, all of us who go there and work with these people always come away impressed with how terrific the people are. We don't say enough about that. We don't have enough forums for praising that. We don't generate enough information on that for young people. I think we probably have to do something with organization of various sorts. There are some areas where we need some management initiatives. Some of that was done last year as a result of the Intelligence Committee reforms. And I think more of that has to be done. So there is in my judgment, there is a whole set of things I think we know what to do in general, and we could put them together and create some very significant improvements in the overall quality and attractiveness of the civil service, particularly in the national security community.
Just to echo points I think that Secretary White's made here, there is no question that one of the strongest assets in the Defense Department is the caliber, depth of expertise of the civilian career force. It's ironic, this is also the 20th anniversary of the Civil Service Reform Act that was enacted in 1978 as part of an effort, again tracing the legacy here at the Maxwell School, that the former dean of Maxwell School, Alan Scotty Campbell, was primarily instrumental in crafting, putting together, as well as serving in the capacity as the last chairman of the Civil Service Reform Commission, or Civil Service Commission, and moving on then to become the first director of the Office of Personnel Management. What's in motion, though, and I think what the Act provides for, that in my experience have an opportunity to see on the civilian side, is the opportunity to move individuals through a range of different career opportunities and professional experiences who are in the senior end of the organization, the career path. Within the financial management community, there were a range of different career senior executive service folks who were able to and accommodated the movement between and among various portfolios in order to expand the nature of their expertise. But that was a rarity. It was very infrequently used authority. That as a consequence, I became convinced that the authorities that are on the books in the statute now that can be utilized are not held often enough, and are typically attributed to the fact that there must be some other legislative impediment that's out there that we need to overcome. No, typically it is just a failure to utilize the authorities that are already extant.
I was very struck as Undersecretary for Policy, the very high quality of the civilians working in the policy part of the Pentagon. Every bit is the outstanding Foreign Service officers who worked for me in the embassy in Jakarta, who worked for me at the State Department. It's one big difference, and it applies to the military as well. The Foreign Service officers every 3 years had a new assignment. It provided variety in their career. It provided an opportunity to move into areas that stretched their abilities, move into areas that fitted their abilities. And a lot of very good people on the civilian side of the Pentagon are in the pretty much the same job without a whole lot of prospect of moving up. And it may be a harder thing to do in the civil service, but I agree with Secretary White. I think it's terribly important for morale and for career development and for continuing to recruit good people. Ambassador Levitsky. Professor Levitsky. We are all professors now.
Right. No, I'm Mel Levitsky. My last job was ambassador to Brazil, and I've recently joined the Maxwell School here. I find this discussion fascinating. But I wanted you, Goldwater-Nichols station period, and then was passed at the height of the Cold War, when, of course, we could identify our major enemy. Our foreign policy lines relatively straight. There were a lot of things that were going on, but essentially we knew what the main task was. Now, if you project the next 10 to 15 years, if we're not going to have a major superpower enemy that would threaten the security of the United States and would have the power to threaten the United States as another major power. So my question, if the future looks like ethnic conflict, regional conflict, internal conflict in some cases, humanitarian crises, and economic chaos, does that say something about the organization, and particularly with the role of the sinks and the role of the Defense Department in this national security structure? Because as General Scowcroft, the civilian agencies often will want to use the military in situations that require low-intensity conflict, not high-tech, but to get ourselves involved in situations like the Balkans. What does this mean from the standpoint of readiness and from the standpoint of the structure that was created by Goldwater-Nichols?
You mentioned your name.
That's a tough one, Mel. It's a very good question. you can say that, in one respect, that more authority and power ought to gravitate out to the sinks, who are the ones who are becoming the experts in the very complicated regional conflicts and so on that are going on now. One of the real problems that this country faces is how to decide on the use of force. We have so many conflicting views now, and they've changed dramatically. They started to change in Vietnam, but since the end of the Cold War, they're changing even more rapidly. And you have the phenomenon now. It's sort of always been present, but it's much more marked now, where the civilian agencies are the ones that say let's use the military. And I think it's partly reassuring, because it wasn't always that way, but it's partly scary, because it seems to me it cloaks a poverty of ideas. When you're up against a really tough problem that you just can't see a good solution, it's easy to say send the military in. And I think our administration has been criticized strongly for, in some cases, we used it more than probably anybody else until this administration used force, but we resisted the use of force in some circumstances where we couldn't figure out that the problem was of a nature that military force would solve it. On that, you've got a Congress now, as Dick points out, not only don't have passports a lot, pride on not having passports, and these general issues are not high on their priority lists, and their interest in foreign policy is episodic. And as much in the Congress, a Republican Congress now, to embarrass the president as it is to the problem. And it tends to be more and more unilateral in a world in which are increasingly reliant on local friends and allies if we want to use force anywhere. That's a description, not a solution.
I think this is not so much a Goldwater-Nichols concern, Mel, as it is an organizational concern inside the executive branch. And as some of us, Brent and others up here said earlier, you do need to deal with also the terrorism issue, the information warfare problem, the infrastructure assurance issues. I think we're a long way from getting those resolved, as was remarked earlier about what's on now and so-called PDT 63.
I think there's one more problem, though, that deserves mention, and I've heard Admiral Lopez subject as well, too. We still have a, I think, in terms of the way the sinks are organized and what their focus is, that's still influenced by the old Cold War days. Obviously, Europe is a special strategic interest to the United States and so forth. But it may be that over time we're going to see more in some other parts of the world. I think of my own business now, for example. I didn't spend a lot of time worrying about Africa when I was Secretary of Defense. It wasn't very important, frankly. Now, as the chairman and CEO of a major energy services company, I care a lot about Angola, Nigeria, Algeria. Those are all absolutely vital parts of the world from the standpoint of our business. And I think over time it may be that the department's going to have to make some changes and adjustments there to more accurately reflect where U.S. interests are in the world. They're no longer just in Europe and the Far East.
Having said all of that and agreeing with a large part of the premise of the question, I have to say this, and that is we don't have a superpower rival today. As has been said earlier, really major changes in our defense establishment take 10 to 20 years, and no one knows what the world is going to look like in 10 or 20 years. And if we were sitting here in the 1920s, I think we would say, well, it's a pretty simple world and pretty safe. And I don't think anything would represent a bigger failure Department of Defense than to find ourselves unable to meet a peer competitor. So while there are all these other small snakes, as Jim Woolsey likes to say, that have to be taken care of in the shorter term, if we miss a big dragon in the long term, we've really messed it up. So that just makes it an even more complicated picture to deal with. Yes.
I'm Brad Averill. I'm a Department of Army civilian here with the Army Comptrollership Program, receiving an MBA. As far as the Goldwater-Nichols Act is concerned, with the increased influence that the chairman of the JCS has in working with the NSC and advising the president, it seems like there might be a bit of a dichotomy in the fact that he has now such a greater role in advising the president, but he has a very limited role as far as he's not in the chain of command. So the information flowing to the president is through the chairman, but the information flowing from the president down to the actual warfighters, the chairman's not in that chain. Now, even though as Secretary Cheney, he made him part of that chain, but that was just unofficial. That was their choice to make that a team effort. And I suspect the successors to Secretary Cheney and General Powell also have that teamwork going. Not the potential there for a conflict in the future if we have personalities involved that don't work so closely together, so that the chairman might not actually be part of the operational situation to the extent he needs to be to provide adequate guidance.
I'm not sure problem there that you can fix it legislatively or by an amendment to Goldwater-Nichols. My instinct would be, just based on experience, that if I did not have working for me a chairman in whom I had confidence, that I wanted him to loop, part of that communications link with the sink, I'd get a new chairman. I think that's the fix for it. I don't think Congress mandate that you always go through the chairman. No, I don't spell that out in advance. I that way. I think it worked well that way on my watch. I suppose it's conceivable that somebody else, some other secretary, might come in and conclude they want to do that for one reason or another. And I guess I wouldn't preclude that option. What this act does, it does provide flexibility. And the very valuable thing it does in terms of information up, it solidifies the role of the chairman as the principal military advisor to the secretary and to the president. That's important. That sort of distinguishes him from the other situation we used to have where you got the lowest common denominator advice. And on the way down, in terms of the chain of command from the president, the secretary to the sink, it places clearly a premium upon the sink being the responsible military official that the civilian leadership will hold accountable for whether or not he carries out his mission and achieves his objectives. But it's flexible, and I guess I wouldn't mess with it.
My sense of it is that it's a theoretical rather than a practical problem. At least back to our days, there isn't any doubt that in the White House we held Colin Powell responsible. When Schwarzkopf did something we didn't like, we didn't go out to Schwarzkopf. He was out in the field. We went to Colin Powell and said, fix it. So as a practical way, I think he was in the substantive chain of command about as fully as going down as he was in advice coming up. That's just my sense.
The other thing that needs to be mentioned here too, and Brent brings it to mind with his comment, probably the most important decision the secretary makes in terms of a military operation, who's going to run it? Now you've got the sinks in place, but when the balloon goes up on a big one, I know I spent a lot of time in the early days of Desert Shield when we were deploying force to the Gulf, addressing the question of, do I want Norm Schwarzkopf to command that operation, or should I get somebody else to do it? And I took that as my responsibility as a secretary to be able to go to the president and, if necessary, and say I'm going to replace this individual. Now, obviously, we concluded Norm was the right guy for the operation, did a superb job, but I spent a lot of time talking to the chairman and others. I didn't know General Schwarzkopf that well at the outset, and it's important to have the ability to do that. In the case of Panama, we weren't able to get the Panamanian situation resolved until I'd relieved the sink, which I did in part in consultation with my compatriot here on the left. And so you start from that fundamental base that if you're going to do a major military operation, the Secretary sort of needs to sit down on day one and figure out who he's going to have command the operation. If a change is required, make that change then. And just as I say, if you got a chairman who's not functioning the way you want him, get yourself a new chairman. But the people you put in place will make it succeed or fail. I might note the presence of the distinguished member of the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, Congressman from Pennsylvania, Jack Murtha, just walked in. Hello, Jack.
So, all those nasty questions about the Congress you've been asking us, save them for lunch.
We have time for, I guess, one more question. Yes, sir.
My name is Tony Jarek. I'm from National Imagery and Mapping Agency, and I'm really about the during the Gulf War, exactly how the decisions were made on a strategic level of moving forces. For instance, the starting part where we put an airborne division as kind of a speed bump, initial speed bump. How was that decision made, and who was in charge of making it? And let me give you the background why I'm asking this question. Because when I look in the law, it states, at least the part we got, was that chief of JCS is an advisor. It's not real clear when you get to actual conflict and you're dealing with making multi-command decisions, especially multi-regional command decisions, where you're going to move troops and who gets what troops and when you put them in and that kind of stuff. And you're dealing with something that's not in a fixed plan because anticipated Kuwait, well, I plans, but clearly Kuwait was a pretty rapid developing arrangement. So the question that what I'm really trying to get to is who's in charge of doing what, making those decisions between you and General Powell and everybody else in NSC and the whole works. I'm just kind of curious, how did that work?
I mean, in terms of picking the force, deploying the force,
deploying when deploying them. You know, maybe even use the first airborne, the airborne division as an example of.
Sure.
Case.
Well, I mean, you always have the Ready Brigade of the 82nd is always standing by. That is, there's one brigade that's designated and that you reach for first when you got a problem. We deployed them to the Gulf once we had the authority to deploy the force. But the way it works, in effect, is nothing moves until the Secretary signs off. The Chairman does not have authority to deploy forces. Any unit that's going to be sent any place, whether we're talking about a small handful of advisors going to Brazil or 500,000 troops to the Gulf, every single deployment requires the signature of the Secretary. And that's one of the key elements, obviously, of maintaining civilian control. How we decided to do it when the Gulf crisis developed, you reach for the plan. You know, there's a plan for every contingency you can imagine. We spend a lot of time planning. The plans are never right. They're always a little bit off. But you reach for the plan, and it'll have a package. There'll be a certain set of forces that automatically have been training for and are prepared, for example, to go to the Gulf. The 24th Division at Fort Stewart was the lead heavy division slated to go to the Gulf in wartime. They trained for it. They had the desert camouflage equipment, etc. You do run into problems. We had 7 heavy, fast sea-lift ships to move the division. We got the first one loaded in Charleston Harbor. We couldn't move it because it was stuck in the bottom of the mud at the Charleston Harbor. Nobody had ever figured out how deep the ship was going to go. Things happen, and you got to compensate for those. But the basic choice about the forces, you start with the basic plan, the tip fiddle, and that's what you build on in terms of ready to decide which units you're going to go with. In my case, we had fairly extensive discussions for Desert Storm. with General Scowcroft and with his boss, obviously the President. We laid out for them in some detail the kinds of forces we were sending, the units we were sending, and so forth. I would not have proceeded with authorizing the deployment without obviously having the President sign off on it first.
But at that level, and in terms of deciding, for example, to put the speed bump in there, that was informal. We had what we called a Gang of 8, I guess, which pretty much ran the war, and we decided it looked, you know, like Iraq may not stop at the Kuwait border, and what could we do? Well, you know, we had a brigade of the 82nd that was available, and could it do much? No. But if we could get it in there, at least the Iraqis would have to run over some American troops, and that was a political decision in which the chairman, as well as, you know, played a full part. The decision of how many forces to put in initially was briefed first by the and then we all discussed it and agreed with that plan, the decision to double the force and so on and so forth. You know, President Bush is known as somebody who didn't meddle in military plan. He didn't pick targets and so on and so forth. And that's absolutely right. But did he know exactly what was going on? Maybe not in detail, but this was a machine running autonomously. It was done politically and strategically at the top, handed over to the secretary and the chairman who had been in the decision making at the top. So it was a smooth chain all the way down.
Let me just invite our panel if there are any comments, and I'll go in reverse order. John?
I've already said more than I know.
And I'll agree with that.
To my co-speaker, John White, it's a pleasure to work with you and have the opportunity to put on a symposium of this magnitude. We're going to be spending another couple of days hereafter sorting through a variety of proposed changes that folks have been unsurfacing or unleashing here in recent days. To Paul Wolfowitz, thank you very much for moderating a very stimulating discussion. And to General Scowcroft and Secretary Cheney, thank you all very much for coming to Syracuse. It's a delight to have you here. Appreciate it very much. Thank you. If I could propose that we take about a 10-minute break, then reconvene for lunch. Our speaker at the immediate conclusion of lunch will be the Honorable Jack Murtha, the state of Pennsylvania, who will offer his commentary as well. We're looking forward to hearing that. Mr. Murtha?
No, I'm going to Caracas.